Well, we're continuing with lesson 71, and we were talking about knights and knighthood. Well, who could become a knight? And how do you become a knight? And what did it mean after you were a knight? Let's talk about some of these things. Let's start from the beginning. A little boy would be born, and his parents would always want him to be a knight. In fact, even when he was really little and he was playing, he could play and pretend that he was a knight in shining armor, fighting his foes and standing up in the tournaments and jousts. But at age 7, that's when he'd really started learning. And he'd learn how to ride a horse, maybe, get on a horse, how to use his spear and his sword. Well, of course, they wouldn't be a real spear and sword in those times, but they might have one that was kind of a replica. And they would learn how to fight each other or sword fight each other. And they would train with the other boys, and all the boys would get in the neighborhood, in the area, and maybe have their so-called little fun times of jousting at their level. Then, suddenly, right after, 7, not too much longer, between 7 and 14 years old, they would be sent off to be a page. And a page would really learn how to take on and off heavy armor, because he would be watching the true knights. A page would take care of the knight's horse, and he'd clean the saddle of the horse, and he would make sure that everything was ready for the knight when he went into a tournament or when he went to war. A page was the knight's helper. At age 14, though, he would become a squire. So remember, page and now squire. And he would definitely be a servant to the knight. He would go wherever the knight would go, and then he would again watch over his horse and his gear and his armor, and he would clean it after a fight, even a bloody fight, and he'd help the knight put on his armor, which was kind of hard to put on, you can imagine. Not only just the helmet and the sword, but the whole dealy-bob, and we'll be talking about the armor. He also had to start, a squire had to start almost like a school system, like learning the law of chivalry, and he had to learn how to be polite, and how to be polite to the knights and to the ladies and to everyone around. He had to speak courteously to everyone. And he had to be neat and have some kind of etiquette when he ate. Before, how boys would eat, like blah, 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 all over. But now he had to learn how to eat when he was around the knights, like as if they were at the Knights of the Round Table. He also had to learn something about carving meat. I wouldn't think that would be a thing you'd have to learn, but each one of the squires had to know how to carve the meat in the time of when the knights got together and ate. And he'd have to learn how to serve in different ways, and serve at a table when they were eating, especially. You can imagine that. So from then, where would he go? Let's talk. Age 16 to 18, he could actually become a knight. That's pretty young, isn't it? He would if he wanted to be a knight, he'd have to go through the ceremony. The ceremony was very specific. They would take the entire evening, and first of all, he had to be praying. Yeah, he had to be praying in the castle for that whole day and evening. And then he would take a bath. But not just a warm bath. He'd have to take a cold bath. Can you imagine that? And then the outfit that he'd dress in would have to be 3 colors. It'd have to be white, red, and brown. White meant purity. Meant that he was pure at heart now. Red meant that blood could be spilled. That he was in charge of spilling blood. That would be in war times mainly. And brown meant the earth, that gradually he would be buried in the earth. It's kind of weird because it kind of looks like, if you could take it into Christian, even in the baptism, meaning that Jesus died for our sins, his blood covers us, and then we died and buried and are risen again to life. It probably came from the Bible in some way. So they go to the ceremony, and then the knight, or the king actually, would take his sword, and he would tap your shoulders with your sword, with a special sword that he had, and he would say, "Bless you as a knight." But then the priest would come in too, because it was a holy thing too, and so he actually would bless you too. So you would get a double blessing from the king and from the priest. Now you'd have your own squire underneath you to help you in all that you did. So now knights, what can they do? First, they could be in tournaments. They could do the jousting with each other. There were usually like tons of knights. You think it was very special of you becoming a knight, but a lot of boys became knights when they turned about 16 and 18. There were hundreds of knights. So how would you tell them apart, especially when they all had on their armor? Because they would all have their specific colors. They would all have their specific banners. They would all have their specific coat of arms, represent their family, their symbols passed down, their colors. And as they would go into the tournaments, they would even go off to war, any place where they needed to be recognized, everyone could say, "Hey, there's my knight. There he is." Because they would see the family coat of arms. They had to have that. Otherwise, they all would look the same. So, and they'd say, "Wow, do you remember that knight? Yeah, I remember his coat of arms. Yeah. Oh, yeah, he's in that family. He came from that family." They were really into their families back then, too. The armor. Well, the armor. They had back then what was called chainmail. Have you ever heard of chainmail? They were hundreds and thousands of little teeny steel rings all over, put together. Can you imagine how long it took to make? Quite a deal, this chainmail. And they'd put it underneath their sheets of armor. Because when a sword would go through, it'd be kind of hard to go through the chainmail. It was a protection, but it was very heavy. And underneath the chainmail, they'd have to wear a cushion padded jacket against their body, so it could get pretty hot in that armor. They would also have a chainmail skirt and a chainmail breastplate and chainmail on their arms and shoulders. And then their legs, they'd have these big armor things they'd have to step into their legs, these plates of mail over them on their legs. Can you imagine how hard it would be to walk in those big things that you are wearing, those big legs that were on your legs? Kind of, and then they had to have something to hold them all together. So they had this special belt that came down and held everything together with the armor and the swords, so that they could have the swords on their sides. They'd have to carry the swords, which were pretty heavy in themselves. You can imagine that. And then their helmet would have to cover their face. The only thing that would be sticking out would be their eyes. You couldn't see anything else. It'd be kind of almost hard to breathe in their armor, but they did. And some of them had a flip side, but most of them had just their eyes put out when they stuck their helmet, and would go over their face even. So what a deal. And even putting on your armor, and then how would you get up on your horse? That's why they needed the squires to help them up on their horses. They'd walk stiffly out, and the squire would help them on, and then they would enter the parade, and in the parade, they'd go through all the townspeople. Everyone there would be cheering on their knights, and the girls would come out and pick their favorite knight, and like I said, chivalry, it was a time that they could look, and it was a time of flirting with each other. They'd say, because most of these knights were not married yet. And so the girls were waiting for their special knight. Although a lot of times, as we learned before, their knight would have to go off to war for months on time. So there was a sad time after that. So here we go in. The horse trots and gallops up and to the front of the ladies and shows off a bit there. And then, it trots and turns around, and then another one, and they have what's called the jousts. The joust, when you think of a joust, what do you think of? You think of something fun, don't you? To me, it didn't seem very fun, although everyone cheered on. They would have blunt swords, though, and a joust would be between two knights running at each other and trying to knock each other off the horses they were on. So, that is quite a deal. So I had looked up some more things about tournaments, and so I'm going to tell you what else. There were some special terms in the tournament. A tournament, when they got a tournament together, it was usually the time of a fair, or and they'd even have seats all the way around for all the people to come and watch the tournaments, and they'd feed the people as they watched the tournaments, and people would be eating kind of like at a baseball game or something, And so the tournaments were pretend battles between groups of knights. When a town or area would have a tournament, they would invite knights from other areas. Typically, the local knights fought against the knights from the outside area. The battle usually took place on a large field. On the day of the tournament, a large crowd would gather to watch, and there would be stands built where the local nobles could sit and watch. Both sides would parade past the spectators, shouting war cries and showing off their armor and coats of arms. What a spectacular event, huh? You could imagine, a lot of movies have been done on the tournaments. The tournament would begin with each side lining up and preparing for the charge. At the sound of a bugle, do-do-do-do-do-do-do, each side would lower their lances and charge! Oh, oh. The knights that were still on their horses after the first charge would turn and charge again! Wow. The turning is where the name tournament or tourney comes from. This would come until one side won. So tournament comes from them turning around and going back. Kind of a weird name to name a tournament that. But that's the way you can imagine. Tournaments were very dangerous. Lances were blunt, they wouldn't be killed, but people were still injured. Knights were still injured. And the best knight from each side won the prize. The prizes could be a lot of different things. They could even be, a date with a beautiful woman, in a way. Who knows? Jousts. Well, I told you about jousts. Let's talk about jousts. Jousting was another very popular competition among knights during the Middle Ages. At a joust where two knights would charge at each other and try to knock each other off the horse with a lance. Jousting was the highlight of many games and events. The winners, they were heroes, and they usually won prize money. They usually had treasures for their jousting. So when we think about that, then all this would happen, and it was kind of like getting prepared to be in a war. And then suddenly they all would have to go off to war. And when they line up and go off to war, everyone would be cheering just like they did in the tournament, but it would not be a tournament anymore. It would be a real thing. These knights would go to possibly lose their lives. And they would be missing ladies, the girls. So they would remember all those songs, and we went over different songs, and they'd be singing the songs at times when they got very lonesome, and as they got together with other knights and talk about those tournament and jousting times and the fun times back in the past. And the girls were probably wondering at home, is my knight ever going to come back? And she'd be thinking of those songs and those sad songs and thinking of the good times and praying for her knight to come back. So what a time. What a medieval times were something very special. A time where you wanted to fall in love with a knight. But knowing that your knight special person that he wasn't as special as the Lord Jesus Christ. You see, the knights took the chivalry, yes, and it was a lot of it had to do about honoring God. And so the basis of all of this was to have a time where the people could put their hope in God. So let's go on and let's talk about these crusades, which were not usually so godly or so honorable.